Love is capable of moving mountains and in some cases driving people to commit unspeakable acts. This is the list of the 5 most notorious killer couples, the list of the double trouble. Let's start with the first couple on the list. Bonnie and Clyde. When you first hear of this couple, you probably think of the American movie of the famous couple who loved each other very much. But did you know that actually they are a criminal couple from the Great Depression era? Their names are synonymous with bank robberies, shootings, and a life on the run. Bonnie, born on October 1, 1910, in Rowena, Texas, grew up in a poverty-stricken family during the Great Depression. She dropped out of school early, taking on various jobs to help support her family. Despite her challenging circumstances, Bonnie had aspirations of becoming an actress and was known for her love of poetry. Clyde Barrow, born on March 24, 1909, in Tellico, Texas, also faced a difficult upbringing. Poverty was a constant presence in his family's life, and Clyde was heavily influenced by his older brother, Buck, who was involved in criminal activities. Clyde's own criminal career began when he was arrested in 1926 for theft, setting him on a path of crime. He frequently found himself in and out of prison, where he honed his criminal skills. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow met in January 1930 at the home of a mutual friend in West Dallas, Texas. Barrow was 20 years old, and Parker was 19. At the time, Clyde was already involved in criminal activities, having a history of thefts and prison stints. Bonnie was married but separated from her husband, and she was living with her mother. Their attraction to each other was immediate, and it's widely accepted by historians that Parker decided to accompany Barrow because she had developed deep feelings for him. She remained devoted to him throughout their criminal endeavors, standing by his side as they committed many crimes. In addition to being charged with stealing cars, Bonnie and Clyde were suspected of many other crimes. By the time they were killed in 1934, they were believed to have committed 13 murders, as well as several robberies and burglaries. In the 4 active years of the Barrow gang, they robbed less than 15 banks, some of them more than once. Despite the effort, they usually got away with very little, in one case as little as $80. Law enforcement officers distributed wanted notices that included fingerprints, photographs, descriptions, criminal records, and more to aid in their capture. FBI agents meticulously tracked the couple's movements, spanning multiple states but with a focus on Louisiana. The turning point came on April 13, 1934, when an FBI agent, while conducting investigations near Ruston, Louisiana, received critical information that led to Bonnie and Clyde's whereabouts in a remote area southwest of Ruston. On the fateful morning of May 23, 1934, law enforcement officers led by former Texas Ranger Frank Hamer had been lying in wait, concealed in the bushes, hoping to catch Bonnie and Clyde. It was approximately 9:15 a.m. when they heard the distinctive sound of a speeding vehicle approaching. In their official report, the officers explained that they had convinced Henry Methvin, an associate of Bonnie and Clyde, to position his truck on the shoulder of the road that morning. They hoped Clyde Barrow to stop and engage in conversation with Methvin, bringing his vehicle within close range of the waiting officers. As the stolen Ford V8, driven by Clyde Barrow himself, approached and slowed down, the officers seized the moment and opened fire. The first shot was fired by an officer named Oakley, possibly before any formal order to do so had been given. Tragically, Clyde was struck in the head by Oakley's initial shot and died instantly. In the chaos of the moment, the officers unleashed a hail of bullets, firing about 130 rounds in total, emptying their weapons into the car. Bonnie Parker, who had been Clyde's companion in crime, also sustained gunshot wounds. They were killed instantly. After the gun battle, the police officers checked the car and found a large stash of weapons, including stolen automatic rifles, sawed-off shotguns, different types of handguns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They also discovered 15 sets of license plates from various states. Gerald and Charlene Gallego. Meet Gerald Armand Gallego and Charlene Adele Gallego, also known as the Love Slave Killers or the Gallego Sex Slave Killers. 2 American serial killers and rapists who seduced innocent youths with the promise of work or marijuana. They turned their sexual desires into a killing spree, causing the deaths of at least 10 young people in California between 1978 and 1980. We had this sexual fantasy, see, so we just carried it out. That I mean, like, it was easy and fun, and we really enjoyed it, so why shouldn't we do it? Stated Charlene. She was born in Stockton, California, on October 10, 1956. She was the only child of her parents and grew up receiving a lot of love and attention. She was a talented violin player and did well in school. However, her life took a turn when her mother was injured in an accident and became disabled. During her teenage years, Charlene started rebelling by going to parties and using her mother's money for gambling. She met Gerald Gallego at a Sacramento poker club on September 10, 1977, just a month before her 21st birthday. She had been married and divorced twice before meeting her partner in crime and moving in with him a week later. Gallego was nearly a decade older and had had a difficult upbringing. His mother worked as a sex worker, and his father faced execution in 1955 for killing a police officer during a prison escape, becoming the first man to be executed in the Mississippi gas chamber. During his childhood, his mother and her multiple partners subjected him to physical abuse regularly, and some of her clients even sexually assaulted him. When Gerald met Charlene, he was working as a bartender and as a trucker. He had been married 4 times before and was accused of molesting his own daughter from a previous marriage during her childhood. One time Gerald brought home a 16-year-old exotic dancer for Charlene after they had been living together for a few months, and they had a threesome. He made sure that the 2 women did not touch each other and that they only touched him. When he returned home from work, he found that the 2 women were having sex alone. In his rage, he beat Charlene and threw her out an open window. Then he refused to have sexual relations with her, claiming he had lost his sexual desire and was now impotent. Charlene suspected Gerald was sleeping with his customers while working as a bartender because he had lost interest in having a sexual relationship with her. After a year, he admitted that he needed a pair of sex slaves to keep him entertained. Charlene agreed to find them out of respect for him and to satisfy her own intense lesbian cravings. The Gallegos were after women. They often abducted 2 people at a time. They would kidnap them from public or semi-public places, often at gunpoint with a .357 Magnum, and take them into their van, where Gerald would rape them repeatedly before killing them in various ways, usually by shooting them with a .25 Beretta or bludgeoning them with an incidental object. They buried their victims in various locations, often in remote or secluded areas. Some of the known locations where they buried their victims include rural areas in California and Nevada. A friend of Miller and Sowers saw them being taken by the Gallegos and reported their car's license plate number. This led to the Gallegos' arrest at a Western Union office where Charlene's parents were sending her money. Both Gerald and Charlene initially claimed they were not guilty of kidnapping and murder. However, Charlene eventually made a deal to testify against Gerald, and her sentence was reduced to 16 years and 8 months in prison. Gerald was sentenced to death in California in 1983 for the murders of Mary Beth Sowers and Craig Miller. In 1984, he was convicted in Nevada for the murders of Karen Twiggs and Stacy Redican, receiving another death sentence, but this was later overturned in 1997. Charlene completed her sentence and was released in 1997. While in prison, she studied psychology, business, and Icelandic literature. In interviews, she claimed to be a victim herself and said she tried to save some of the victims' lives. In 2002, Gerald Gallego died of cancer in a Nevada prison medical center while waiting for execution. Ray and Fay Copeland. Ray and Fay Copeland were a married couple engaged in criminal activities as a con artist couple. Ray eventually turned to serial murder, with Fay assisting him. They went from being loving grandparents to serial killers, who used the clothing of their victims to make winter quilts to snuggle under. At the ages of 76 and 69, they were the oldest couple in American history to be sentenced to death. Ray Copeland, born in Oklahoma in 1914, experienced a childhood marked by constant family moves in search of work opportunities. His family's situation became worse during the Great Depression, leading him to drop out of school and resort to various means to make money. Dissatisfied with low wages, he turned to schemes aimed at tricking people out of their property and money. In 1939, he was convicted of theft of livestock and check forgery, resulting in a 1-year jail sentence. In the spring of 1940, Ray went to see a doctor, and there he met Fay, a 19-year-old woman. Fay came from a large but poor family in Harrison. She and Ray started dating, and after just 6 months, they got formally married. Together they had 5 children. To support their growing family, Fay Copeland turned back to stealing livestock from ranchers. However, he wasn't very good at it, as he frequently got caught and ended up spending time in jail on multiple occasions. Thus, he was banned from buying and selling livestock, so he needed a plan to continue operating without being traced by the police. His solution involved hiring travelers and wanderers to work on his farm. He would set up bank accounts for them, instruct them to purchase livestock using bad checks from their accounts, and then sell the animals. Afterward, the hired help would be fired and sent away. This tactic kept the police at bay for some time, but eventually, he was caught and sent back to jail. Upon his release, he returned to the same scam but ensured that the hired individuals would vanish without a trace to avoid getting caught. In October 1989, the police in Missouri received a tip about possible human remains on a farm belonging to the couple. After a week-long search of the Copeland property, authorities made significant discoveries. They found 3 bodies, a list of farm helpers compiled by Fay, and a bed cover made from the clothing of the victims. The following week, investigators searched another barn that Ray had purchased and uncovered 2 additional bodies. Following these discoveries, both Ray and Fay were arrested. Prosecutors presented Fay with a deal. If she cooperated by disclosing the locations of more bodies, her charge would be reduced to conspiracy to commit murder, resulting in only a few months in jail for her cooperation. However, Fay appeared to protect her husband and claimed ignorance about Ray's killings. Despite her refusal to provide further information, the Copelands were formally charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. Upon performing autopsies, it was determined that each man had been shot at close range in the back of the head. Remarkably, there were 12 names in the register, including those of the 5 victims discovered, each marked with a crude X in Fay's handwriting next to them. During Fay Copeland's trial, her lawyer tried to argue that she had been a victim of abuse by Ray and suffered from battered women syndrome. However, the jury did not accept this as a sufficient excuse for her involvement in the murders. Fay was found guilty of murder and received a death sentence by lethal injection. Ray was also later found guilty and sentenced to death. Fred and Rosemary West, an English married couple, who were serial killers and rapists, committed a series of heinous crimes that involved the murder of at least a dozen young British girls, including some of their own daughters. Fred was born in the Herefordshire town of Muchmarkel. According to Fred, various forms of sexual abuse were common in the household. He claimed his father had sexual relationships with his daughters and taught him bestiality, sex with animals. Like the stories about his father, it has been suspected that Fred's mother began sexually abusing him when he was 12, though he never admitted to it, and it has never been confirmed. Fred claimed that he also engaged in incest and may have gotten his sister pregnant at 14. When Fred was 21, he returned to Muchmarkel, where he resumed a romantic relationship with an ex-girlfriend, Catherine Rena Costello, who had been a petty thief when they first dated and moved on to prostitution. Though Rena was already pregnant with a Pakistani man's child, they married and kept the child. To explain why the baby was half Asian, Fred had Rena write to her parents and say that the baby had died in childbirth and that her child, Charmaine Carroll, had been adopted. They married in November, just 2 months after reuniting, and moved to Scotland together. In July 1964, the couple had their own child, a daughter named Anne-Marie. Throughout their rocky marriage, Fred worked as an ice cream truck driver, a job that allowed him easy access to interact with young women. Their time in Scotland took a tragic turn when Fred accidentally ran over a 4-year-old boy with his ice cream truck. After her marriage with Fred fell apart, Costello returned to Scotland on her own but felt the pull to reunite with her daughter. She came back in July 1966, only to find out that Fred had entered into a relationship with McFall. In 1967, McFall became pregnant with Fred's child and urged him to divorce Costello. In a gruesome turn of events, Fred responded by murdering, dismembering, and burying McFall. Fred is believed to have committed other murders after. Following the death of his mother in February, he became involved in numerous minor thefts and continually changed jobs. It was during a period when he worked as a bakery truck driver that he crossed paths with his future wife and accomplice, Rosemary Letts. Rosemary was 12 years younger and came from a similar background. Rosemary was a sexually active teen who charged money for sex with her parents' adult friends, despite being strictly disciplined and frequently raped by her father. As a teenager, Rosemary became more sexually active, and there was an incident where she was found getting into bed with one of her younger brothers and engaging in inappropriate sexual behavior with him. While Fred was in jail for thefts and failing to pay his fines for previous crimes, Rosemary became pregnant with his child, a girl named Heather, and raised his children on her own. She frequently abused her de facto stepdaughters due to her temper issues and anger about caring for children who were not hers. During the summer of 1971, Rosemary appeared to have a complete breakdown and killed Charmaine. Afterward, she dismembered the body by severing the fingers and toes, and Fred buried the remains under the kitchen floor. Fred encouraged Rosemary to have sex with other men for money and fun, and he frequently watched her through a peephole. He also took erotic photos of her and published them in swinger magazines as prostitution advertisements. In June 1972, Fred and Rosemary had another daughter, Mae West, so they relocated to 25 Cromwell Street. It was at this new residence that they committed their acts of rape and murder. Rosemary continued her prostitution business from their home, which included a room equipped with peepholes for Fred's surveillance. They also had a red light outside the room that signaled the children not to enter during her work. Over the following years, she gave birth to 7 more children. Some were by her husband, some by her clients, and possibly one by her father. In October 1972, Fred and Rosemary hired a young woman named Caroline Owens to work as a nanny for their children. They repeatedly made unwanted sexual advances towards her, which she consistently rejected. One evening in December, after their unsuccessful attempts to seduce her, she attempted to leave but was forcibly held captive overnight. Fred threatened to allow his friends to assault her and then kill her, which led her to comply with their demands. When released, Caroline decided to press charges, but Fred managed to convince the court that the acts she was forced into were consensual. Consequently, Fred and Rosemary were fined $50 for indecent assault instead of facing more severe penalties. Over the following 6 years, Fred and Rosemary continued their spree of killing and murdering at least 8 young women who either lived at or worked at 25 Cromwell Street as renters or employees. While committing murders, Fred also sexually abused Anne-Marie West, his daughter from his relationship with Rena Costello. She became pregnant eventually, but the pregnancy had to be terminated because it occurred in her fallopian tube. Fred got rid of the victims by burying them under the house's garage or in the garden. He pretended to do regular home improvements to hide his many burials. He often stole and fenced the loot in order to afford the necessary supplies. Despite the fact that he was frequently brought to the attention of the police, his killings went unnoticed. When Heather told her friends about the abuse she had suffered, the couple came dangerously close to being exposed. To silence her, Fred and Rosemary strangled her to death in June of the following year. She was dismembered and buried in the garden after that. The Wests were finally exposed in May 1992, when Fred videotaped himself raping one of his daughters. When she told her friends, one of them called the cops. Hazel Savage, the investigating officer, had heard of Fred while he was dating Rena Costello. When another victim of Fred's rape came forward, police obtained a search warrant. They searched the house for evidence of child abuse in August. Rose was arrested as an accomplice to Fred's rape and sexual assault of a minor. While they were being processed, the government took care of their younger children. While Fred was in custody, Rosemary struggled with depression and even made a suicide attempt, which was prevented by one of her sons. Unfortunately, The rape case against Fred fell apart as the victims withdrew their cooperation. However, Detective Hazel Savage continued to dig into the West's past, Heather's disappearance, and interviews with the West children. Savage obtained another search warrant to excavate the property. As human bones started cropping up, Fred claimed sole responsibility for the murders to protect Rosemary, although he refused to admit to raping the victims, claiming that they willingly wanted to have sex with him. Eventually, the bodies of Ann McFall and Charmaine West were also discovered. To protect herself, Rosemary cut off all contact with her husband. He was charged with 12 counts of murder, and on New Year's Day, he committed suicide in his prison cell by hanging himself with a knotted bedsheet. His funeral was attended only by 5 of his children. Rosemary faced trial, initially for rape and later for murder. She consistently denied any involvement in the murders, and the evidence against her was largely circumstantial. A significant witness was Janet Leach, who had acted as Fred's appropriate adult during questioning. She revealed that Fred had told her Rose had been complicit in the murders and had even killed Charmaine West and Shirley Robinson on her own. On November 22, 1995, Rosemary was found guilty of 10 murders and received a life sentence in prison with no chance of parole. Despite maintaining her innocence, she announced in 2001 that she would not pursue an appeal of her conviction. Henry Lee Lucas and Ottis Toole. Bonded together by shared childhood trauma, Henry Lee Lucas and Ottis Toole became lovers, then serial killers who terrorized America in the 1970s. There have been many serial killer couples throughout history, but few were as fearsome as Henry Lee Lucas and Ottis Toole. This duo killed around hundreds of people and raped throughout the United States in the 70s. Ottis Toole was born on March 5, 1947, in Jacksonville, Florida. His early life was marked by hardship, as he claimed to have suffered sexual abuse at the hands of family members. Toole exhibited disturbing behavior from a young age, including animal cruelty and arson. Toole's grandmother was a Satanist who forced him to rob graves for body parts for satanic rituals. His mother humiliated him by forcing him to dress like a girl, and his sister raped him when he was younger than 10. Also, when he was 5 years old, his father prostituted him to a neighbor. He admitted to committing his first murder when he was 14 years old. After being picked up by a traveling salesman who forced him to have sex, Toole ran the man down with his own car. Toole was diagnosed as developmentally disabled as a child, and he soon dropped out of school at 10, the age at which he realized he was gay. Thus, he turned to a life of petty crime that would eventually lead him into a partnership with Henry Lee Lucas. Henry Lee Lucas also had a very similar upbringing like Ottis. Their mothers were both abusive, and they were forced to dress as girls. Lucas' father's legs were cut off in a railroad accident, making him jobless and causing him to drink himself to death. Lucas lost an eye when he was 10 years old because his mother ignored an infection he had for far too long. He murdered his mother when he was 23 years old in 1960, and he served a decade in prison for the crime. When asked about his crime, he stated that all he remembered was slapping her. He realized he had a knife in his hand when she fell and died. He had been resentful of his mother for his entire life because of the abuse he had suffered at her hands. Her status as a sex worker and a drunk didn't help his opinion of her. Lucas began torturing animals as a teenager, with all of his rage boiling inside him. He also abused his brother sexually. In 1976, the deadly couple met at a soup kitchen. They had become lovers in no time, and their relationship was more than just a mutual romantic attraction. They also shared a desire to kill. Once they realized their shared appetite for violence and murder, they embarked on a killing spree across 26 different states. They showed no discrimination in their choice of victims, targeting sex workers, migrants, and hitchhikers. Murder became a disturbing way for them to strengthen their twisted bond. They talked about it openly, comparing notes and giving each other tips. Henry Lee Lucas, known for leaving evidence behind, taught Ottis Toole how to avoid getting caught by law enforcement. Besides murdering, they also tortured and raped them before dismembering their bodies. The two men had attempted cannibalism, which they discussed over a prison phone. Toole sounded nostalgic as they discussed it. He recalled that some of the people they ate tasted like real meat after they coated them in barbecue sauce. Lucas then said that they felt no remorse for what they had done. He even made a joke about having driven across 2 states while carrying a severed head in the back seat of his car. The relationship between Henry Lee Lucas and Ottis Toole crumbled when Lucas developed a fascination with Toole's teenage niece, Becky Powell. Lucas confessed to enjoying the feeling of having someone look up to him, encouraging him to run away with her and leave Toole behind. Toole's pain over this betrayal allegedly drove him to commit 9 murders as a way to cope with his anger and frustration. However, Henry Lee Lucas and Becky Powell's escape was short-lived. Despite initially settling on a ranch in Ringgold, Texas, their relationship soured, leading to a heated argument. In response, Lucas lured Powell to an isolated field, where he killed her, dismembered her remains, and scattered them. Furthermore, Lucas attracted the woman who owned the ranch to the same field, where he also killed her and buried her body in a drainage pipe. They didn't remain free for long. In 1983, Henry Lee Lucas was initially taken into custody for weapon possession, while Ottis Toole was arrested in Florida for killing a 64-year-old man by setting him on fire. Once they were in custody, they began confessing their crimes. Toole claimed that he had taken a child from a Sears parking lot. He drove around with the head in his car for so long that he forgot it was there after he chopped off the young boy's head with a machete. Upon finding it later, all he did was toss it into a canal. By Toole's count, they'd murdered 108 people, including a 6-year-old boy named Adam Walsh. He had a tendency to lie. He exaggerated his crimes. Because of this, the exact number of murders that Ottis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas have committed is still unknown. In 1996, Toole died in prison after his liver failed, while Lucas died in 2001 after a heart failure. What did you think of these couples, and which one did you find most interesting? Tell us in the comments below and follow for more interesting crime stories.